Hello everyone, thanks so much for making the time to come today. Delighted to have this event, Using Evidence to Influence Policy, particularly the role of early and mid-career researchers, and thrilled to welcome my two fabulous colleagues from the Young Academy of Ireland. First we have Dr. Kieran Walsh, who's the Deputy Director of Health Technology Assessment at HIQA, and we have Dr. Karina Dorley, who's Associate Research Professor of Economics at the ESRI. So they've both made the time to be with us today, which we're really grateful for, both hugely experienced in this area as well. So we hope you enjoyed the session. We hope that it's going to be interactive as well, so that we'll be able to have a dialogue with you. We're going to use Mentimeter, so hopefully you have your phones or whatever, but if not, don't worry, we can chat about it as well. And you'll all have gotten your handout, and the idea for the handout is that today you walk away with at least some steps that you might take towards using your research for policy. So hopefully that you'll have some concrete actions from that as well. So just in terms of how we're going to go through the day, first we're going to talk about the Young Academy of Ireland and its relationship with using evidence for policy and how that works. That's going to start with Kieran, and then we're going to have Karina, who's going to talk about engaging with national policy as an early or mid-career researcher. And then finally, I'm going to come to myself, and I'm going to talk about the European context for early and mid-career researchers in terms of influencing policy. So we're just going to start with we wanted to make sure that everybody was on the same page. So if we could just start with this Mentimeter, just to see what's your discipline, but also what do you want to get out of the session. And hopefully this works smoothly. It never does, but that's the other side of it.
Sorry, could you please go back to the...
Yeah. So it's 82154637. Okay, so hopefully everybody's in by now. Yeah? You're not getting into it?
No. But I'm from politics.
Okay. Yes. Yes. I see some. So we have some people from sports science, we have people from psychology, we have people from HR, and people talking about looking at strategic planning for their careers, which I think is so important, and keen to get perspective from policymakers on engagement with academia. Well, so hopefully we can actually deliver on that. Looking at psychology and how we can engage with stakeholders effectively to influence policy. And also we have a registered nurse here who's a research assistant in organisation systems in healthcare. So already with those responses we can see that we probably have a diverse group, and it's going to mean something different to each and every individual. So you can work away on those, or we'll move to the next one. So I'm going to hand over now to Kieran, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the Young Academy.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kieran Walsh, Deputy Director of HIQA, proud member of Young Academy Ireland. So just give a very brief background to myself. I'm a pharmacist by background. Got very interested in the whole evidence for policy space during my PhD. I did the Sphere PhD, I'm not sure if some of you know it, in the health space. It's structured policy in health research, health education research programme. And then certainly through my own work in HIQA, we do a lot of, I suppose, our large team of analysts. We work to, provide evidence-based advice to the Minister for Health and to the Health Service Executive. So, I'm quite interested in this space, and I'm very happy to take questions. So just to give you a very brief background to the Young Academy Ireland, so this is what joins us together here today. It was founded back April 2023. It was the 51st National Young Academy globally. So it's, I suppose when we say Young Academy, it's not age necessarily, it's stage in career. So you people of all ages really involved. So it is definitely a growing global movement of joining people of very interdisciplinary backgrounds together. So this is, Young Academy Ireland is an interdisciplinary organisation of early career researchers and innovators that brings together individuals who work collaboratively for the benefit of society. We're quite a diverse, engaged group internally, so there are 60 of us currently. We come from nearly, I think, all universities really on the island are covered. We've other kind of agencies, ESRIs, HIQA, CHAGASC as well. So, it is beyond just the traditional academic settings. In terms of disciplines, it's quite wide-ranging, health, biology, engineering, law, languages, you name it, it's there and it's growing. I suppose in terms of, who we are really, I suppose, we have, committed to making a difference in society, leadership potential and so on. And we do have like a membership. People are interested on our website. The 60 of us, there's bios for all of us up there if people want to find out a bit more about us individually. But we are becoming, I suppose, we're still quite new, but we are trying to spread the message. We're trying to get recognised as a source of expertise. We have been invited to certain consultations, for example, Research Ireland with a government science advisor, and we are establishing various networks on the island. And really, I suppose we're trying to get across the message that we can act as a convener of early to mid-career expertise. We're very much under the auspices of the Royal Irish Academy, but we are independent in activities, just to let people know that. We've quite fruitful interactions with the Royal Irish Academy. So, we are linked in with the broader ecosystem. I know Jenny is going to speak to the European our European relationship in a bit more detail, but just to give you kind of the bird's eye view, we are linked with other young academies, so Scotland, UK, Swedish, Swiss. We're co-hosting ENYA, so next year if people are interested in that, that would be probably in Dublin. It's the European Network of Young Academies. And then internationally then the Young Academy of Europe, Global Young Academy, IAP, International Science Council, so lots going on. I'll draw people's attention to our strategic plan. It's quite an interesting document. It's on our website. We basically, just kind of outlines our direction of travel for the next 5 years. We have 5 grand challenges: sustainability, fair and inclusive society, future of academia, public involvement and engagement with research, and transdisciplinary expertise for public policy. So it is this last kind of grand challenge that really is kind of why we're here today. It really is part of this kind of wider work that we're trying to do to kind of use our interdisciplinary expertise to kind of connect early to mid-career researchers and policymakers in a better way for the benefit of society, really. So just not going to go into it in too much detail, but there's lots of things that, Young Academy more broadly is involved in. So a lot of mentoring activities going on. Imagine is a great initiative which has been led by Jenny. It's about empowering young people by bridging gaps. We've a lot of work on narrative CV workshops, developing public engagement. There's a book in development as well. And, we're also quite specific activities about engaging with national bodies and initiatives, as I said, contributed to various consultations, and identifying barriers and suitable supports for ECRs in their research and engagement with policy and broader contributions. If anyone's interested, we have a narrative CV toolkit, available online, lots of resources on our website, but also we have a workshop upcoming in May. Maybe some of your students might be interested, or some of your colleagues, or you yourself. And in terms of specifically, relevant to today's policy engagements that we've been involved in, so we're quite closely linked into the Civil Service Research Network, which is a really interesting, fairly recent initiative by the various government departments, where their research people, for want of better words, are kind of joining the dots a bit more, and they are reaching out to us as we're trying to join the dots with all the ECRs across the island. And the Civil Service Research Network is kind of under the governance of the Government Science Advisor, that's Professor Aoife McLysett, who we met back in March. So there is ongoing engagements there as well. And in the north as well, we have met specifically with certain government departments as well, and there's been very productive engagement there. So I'm going to hand you, so that's just a flavour of like who we are and what we're about, and this is what we're trying to achieve. So I'm going to hand you over to Karina now. Yeah, great.
Thanks, Kieran. Hi, everyone. My name's Karina Dorley. I am an economist. I work at the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin. And since I was an early career researcher, I mean, I think in some ways I would still consider myself early to mid, but I've always worked at economic policy institutes where the focus was conducting research to influence policy. The early part of my career I spent in research institutes in Luxembourg and Germany, and then I moved to the ESRI nearly 10 years ago now. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about engaging with national policy as an early career researcher. I suppose what I'm going to talk about is based on my own experience. Mostly I'm going to engage with the literature on this a little bit, but a lot of this is just based on my experience of what works and what doesn't work, because among the 3 institutes that I've spent my time working at, some have done things a lot better than others. So I've got good examples and bad examples to draw from. So just taking a step back, if we want to engage with policy as any kind of researcher, who are we engaging with? So, I mean, technically, the people making the decisions are the ministers of the day, but they are briefed by their civil servants. So the civil servants are the ones collecting the research, interpreting it, synthesising it, and providing it in policy briefs to the ministers. And ministers rely very heavily on that being done to a high level. And who are civil servants, and what is their job like? So they have a really tough job. So they are very, very time poor, in my experience. They work to very strict deadlines, and they're often working on long-term projects, short-term projects, and then responding to things that arise in the course of the day that could have any impact on their department. So, you know, on a daily or an hourly basis sometimes. So they have to prioritise and rejuggle their work quite a lot. So these are just really good things to keep in mind if you want to be engaging with people like this and you want them to you know, kind of take your research seriously. Sometimes they have to answer impossible questions in impossible timeframes, and they don't have, or there simply isn't time to conduct new research or examine all of the available research. And sometimes, you know, synthesis is the best option that they have. And they also have varying skill levels and abilities to interpret and collate research. So some civil servants are very good at carrying out research, at interpreting it, at reading it. Others are not. They tend to be all-rounders. So it's really good to keep in mind that, you know, if you want to target your own research at policymakers, it should ideally be in a very understandable form. So then what do they want from researchers? So if you look at the 3 answers I have up here, it goes from very cynical to very idealistic to maybe something more realistic. Okay, so the cynic might say, well, actually they don't want anything. They just want, you know, to make decisions that the ministers have already sort of decided upon, and you know, not have anything rock the boat. I don't think that's true mostly, but sometimes there just simply isn't time for research to inform policy if a decision needs to be taken today on something that has just occurred. So government responding to a crisis, they tend to rely on evidence that's already out there. There isn't time to look for new evidence. So sometimes what they want is nothing or nothing new, right? So they just want to rely on evidence that's already out there. The idealists, then, we're all researchers. We'd all like to think that, you know, they're planning way ahead and they're basing everything they do on robust scientific evidence. And some of the time they are. So certain long-term policy decisions do require this substantive evidence base, and it is collected rigorously, and the research is sought through commissions or public consultations, or whatever that is. But if you keep in mind that a typical government term is 5 years, right, I'd say that's maybe more a medium-term perspective. It's very hard to think in the very long term if you think you're not going to be, you know, there to carry out or to finalise the policy if it's going to happen, you know, plus 5 years from now. So I think realistically something in between is typically what they're looking for. There's always a trade-off between the rigour of the research and how robust it is and how timely it is. Okay, so sometimes timely trumps rigour and sometimes it's the other way around. Ideally you get both, but a lot of policy is based on evidence that is provided in a timely manner and is robust enough that it can be relied on. So what do they want then? They want policy evidence that's timely. And by timely, I mean, so it arrives at the right time, right? Or it is already there and it resurfaces at the time that it is needed. It's not buried somewhere. Timely also really means that it's still up to date. So if it's something that was produced in the past, is it still relevant? You know, and a lot of research that was done in the past still has policy lessons for today, but can we draw those out? Is it possible to extrapolate from old research to address new policy questions? Crucially, it has to be understandable. So some of our research is necessarily technical, you know, or abstract or theoretical, but it's always very helpful if something like that is accompanied by either an executive summary or a short policy brief that really draws the link between this very technical or complicated piece of research and the policy landscape. And they also want evidence that is robust enough that if they have to make a decision that is going to be unpopular, which they often do, right, that it's robust enough that they can fall back on it and say, well, listen, you know, we have to increase taxes or we have to increase the retirement age because otherwise the numbers show that we're going to run out of money, right? So, you know, something that's a really sound basis for a decision that has to be taken but is unpalatable. So a lot of the time they ask for this research. So things to look out for are public consultations. There are lots of public consultations going on where they, you know, various departments will invite submissions from experts, from the public, so on. It's a really good way to write up the findings of your research in a really understandable, digestible 2-pager, 4-pager, and send it in so that it can be taken into account in the policy process. Sometimes research is commissioned as well, so there might be a tender on a department website or another stakeholder website that is specifically looking for something that might be in your research area. So those are, you know, kind of easy things to look out for. So how do we as researchers, and particularly as early career researchers, how do we actually provide this kind of information? Early career researchers, I think in particular, can be they can be slow to shout about their research in a public way because they're not sure if they've done all of the sensitivity analyses or if it stands up to all of the scrutiny that can be thrown at it. And that's probably true for most journals and peer review processes. But for policy, you know, the goalposts they're different, right? So it needs to be good enough that we can base a solid policy on it. And it can be hard to see where that line is. Is my research, you know, enough to base policy on? Sometimes it might be the only thing out there that does actually provide evidence for the policy change that's needed, in which case then absolutely, yes, it is crucial evidence, even if you don't think that everything stands up to all of the robustness checks that referee 2 asked for. So looking for clues in the programme for government and policy documents that are posted on government websites and consultation calls are really good ways to see if your research fits with the policy questions of the day and how it might be extended maybe in a simple way to deal with some of these questions. Something that's really important is being available. So the lighthouse of public attention falls on certain areas briefly and then shifts away. The next crisis occurs and it's another policy issue. If you're not there to promote your research or to suggest that this could be a useful evidence base for what needs to happen, when, you know, let's say the media are talking about a certain issue or the minister has said, oh, I think we need to look at this, then you might not get another chance for quite a while. So being available and having research that is, or being able to extrapolate your research to current policy areas is really important. So if you can be keeping an eye on things like consultations and the programme for government and the direction the policy seems to be going, it can be easier to actually be available for these things when they come up. It's nice to let people know if you do have a piece of research that you think is a good evidence base for policy. It's good to let people know, you know, ministry contacts, department contacts, or even strangers in departments, you know, hey, you might find this interesting. it's in everybody's interest that ministers are briefed on things that they might get surprised with in the media. So it's always good to let people know, even if they ignore your email or don't actually care. You never know. It might be important. So let me just finish up on the advice section. So, I've spoken about civil servants having a really tough job, and sometimes it can be, you find research and go, oh, but they didn't see how important this is or whatever, and that's grand. But for a lot of them, what we think is a groundbreaking piece of research just doesn't seem like Moses coming down from the mountains for them. So, don't take it personally. It's fine. Somebody else will find it interesting. Try and keep your research up to date. So I suppose what I mean up to date is how does it relate to what's going on in Ireland at the moment if you want to contribute to the national policy debate. So, be available, submit to commissions if you can, send your research to contacts or even to strangers at relevant public bodies, and be the helpful expert. But again, just don't take offence if you get ignored. These are busy people. If you're open to it, being media ready is really helpful too. So if you can explain your research to the media, if you can explain it to a journalist or to the public on the radio, then you can definitely explain it to a policymaker. So those two things are very complementary, I would say. And, being open to speaking to the media about your research is also a great way to get it into the public domain and get it onto the agenda. So, don't be afraid to do that. The only thing is, it's quite time intensive and you cannot control the narrative. So you might be as diplomatic as you can be in what you say to the media, and you can never control what kind of clickbait headline they're going to go with. So just one of the downsides. Okay, so I might just finish with a short framework. So policy windows are moments where we consider changes more feasible. It's going to be easier to get a policy change through because we've got the problem, the policy, and the politics stream aligning. So the problem stream, think about that as an event or a crisis or something that changes the public perception and lets people know we think there is a problem as a society. There's a problem here and we need to solve it. The policy stream is when a policy has been identified. So either it's a new policy that's been identified, or it's something that's been identified before and now it seems to fit with the problem stream that can solve it. And then the political stream, it's always easier to get new things through when there's an electoral change, leadership shift, or when kind of public opinion really seems to be shifting in a dramatic way. So when these three things align, it's a lot easier to get policy change through. So these windows are opportunities. And as researchers, it's helpful to monitor when we think these windows might be opening. And, by monitoring, what the media is saying about your particular area and what the ministers are saying, and so on. And if events are sort of making your research more relevant at the moment, you might be able to identify those windows and consider them a chance to really promote your research. Okay, and then I'm just going to finish with the policy cycles. Might kind of seem obvious, but it is helpful to think about. So we start with agenda setting. That's up here, okay? Sorry, agenda settings here. So agenda setting in the Irish political context, you probably think of it as like writing the programme for government. The programme for government is like the blueprint for what they're planning to do over the next 5 years. So that's when policymakers decide what gets onto the agenda. Of all the problems out there, these are the ones on our agenda. The second step is policy formulation. So are there any options to solve these problems? How much do they cost? Are they feasible? Is anyone going to like them? The third step is a decision gets made. The decision might be do nothing. It might be let's adopt one of these policy changes. The fourth is implementation, so the policy actually rolled out, monitored, and so on. And then we're onto policy evaluation. So did it work? Were there unintended consequences, etc.? So that policy evaluation stage can then feed into the agenda setting as well if problems are identified. So you can see, looking at this, there are, at every stage of this process, it's possible to feed in evidence for policy, but the evidence you feed in might be different at each stage. In particular, when you get to the policy implementation stage, it's not particularly helpful to be, publishing something that says this is a waste of time. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't publish something like that, but it just means that it's not likely to feed into the policy process because the decision has already sort of been made. So, you know, if you can identify where in the policy cycle certain things are, it can also make it easier to decide when you should approach somebody with your research or try to promote your research. Okay, so that's it from me. Let me just finish by asking you maybe if you can identify the stakeholders who are relevant for your work. So here, I'd be thinking, you know, there's probably a government department that you would consider a stakeholder. There might be other NGOs or other public bodies that you would consider as stakeholders. So if you could have a think about who the stakeholders are, you can stick them into the Mentimeter, you can write them on your handouts either, and we can have a look at the results. I suppose the purpose of this is, so we've got a few people in the room from the same sort of discipline, but you might identify different stakeholders. And sometimes it's hard to be aware of all the stakeholders that actually might be interested in your area of research. You let me know when this answer's coming in and I'll switch. Mm-hmm. Does anyone not know who their stakeholders might be? Anyone not able to identify any stakeholders for their research? That's good. Okay. How do I get on to the next one here, Jenny? This one? Yeah. Uh-huh. Oh, we didn't do this one. What do you want to get out of this? There we go. Yeah. Okay. So we might go back to the what do you want to get out of this session one before we go on to stakeholders. So what do you want to get out of this session? Ideas, examples, challenges, and inspiration. Inspiration. What, are we feeling inspiring today? Understanding the steps to develop or influence policy. So hopefully the policy windows and the policy cycle are helpful in thinking about those things. Tips on how to use the research I'm currently working on will influence policy to ensure patients receive safe healthcare. Very good. Reflect on my process. Learning as an early career researcher. Health service.
I really like this one. In understanding how to ensure research is designed to inform or have an influence on policy from the outset.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the big things we want to get out of today is, you know, planning for that from the start.
Oh yeah, Jenny, Mike.
Oh, yeah. Planning for that from the start rather than an add-on, I think is such a great start for anybody who's kind of stepping onto their career pathway. Because oftentimes it's an afterthought for people, or it comes a little bit away into your career and you're like, wow, if only I knew then what I know now. So hopefully from today you'll get something that will help you to identify how you start engaging with policy.
Has anyone ever started a piece of research intending it to end up on a policymaker's desk? Yeah? Do you want to tell us about it?
I started with towards the policy, but I think it's going to end up as a guideline, but hopefully in the future it will turn out to be a policy. So I recently got funding from Research Ireland about developing the guidelines for dentists for oral cancer pathways and management. We have the guidelines for the GPs for cancer referrals and management, but we don't have anything as such for dentists, not as such which is there in the published research evidences. But like having a conversation with dentists, I know certainly that there are no guidelines. So hopefully we'll be able to kind of develop the guidelines and contact the National Cancer Control Program. They are on board. So it will turn out into a policy.
That's great. And, you know, sometimes work starts out as very obviously being, you know, designated for policy. So in that scenario, you had funding to develop guidelines, and presumably because you applied for this funding, you had funding to develop these guidelines. So it was always policy focused. It can be harder to think about it when you're just doing your blue skies research, right? And you're kind of trying to answer a question that you think is underexplored and do it the best you can. And sometimes it can be hard to make that link between what you're doing, your kind of rigorous academic work, and what actually could be useful for policy. Does anyone have any experience of accidentally or on purpose doing that? Yeah?
Hi. I would have been here 20 years. I would have written a lot of poetry and being invited into migrant not networks, but in the 2012, 13, 2015, around that, when a lot of funding was available. Trying to think, Migrant Council of Ireland. I live in Dublin, so all of those spaces. And for poetry workshops, and then these are the poems that have been in the migrant reports, which have shaped migrant policy in Ireland. So that was quite surprising, but it was accidental.
That's amazing.
But yeah, it's all out there, and that today what we're seeing is we did the base. The baseline was all our work 20 years back. Yeah.
Because I must say, our arts and humanities colleagues in Young Academy Ireland often feel that the evidence for policy stuff isn't really their wheelhouse, that their work isn't as useful for policy as, let's say, the hard sciences.
That's not true, because
absolutely not true.
Arts Council has, done amazing work. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that.
Sorry, Karina, I have a
Yes,
question.
yes.
I don't need a mic. It's for the recording. Sorry. No worries.
Karina,
Yes.
please tell me what you mean by ministers don't like surprises.
So this is from my experience. The minister always likes to be briefed on anything that the media might ask them, right? And for me, I feel like if I am going to put out research, let's say I have a piece of research that's quite, that might reflect badly on a current policy, right? I would send that to the relevant department so that the civil servants can brief the minister on it before it goes out. And I would do that out of professional courtesy so that they're ready to respond if they get asked, which maybe they would never get asked about it. But if they get asked, what do you think about this new research that's out that says this policy isn't working, that they can respond so that they're aware of it. That's all. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah?
You mentioned about finding the commissions. Sorry, not finding the commission. You mentioned about the commission in your slides. So where do we exactly find those commissions?
So you mean commissioned reports, calls for commissioned reports, is that what you mean? Yeah. So some departments will issue sort of tenders for work that they want to be done, right? So if there's something in the programme for government that says we're going to investigate, changing this policy, over the course of the government term, they might issue a tender to say, this is the scope of work we want to do, or they're inviting applications to tender for this research, and then the successful applicant gets the funding and carries out the research. So I don't think there's any centralised system for, is there? Okay.
There's a tendering website.
Okay. Into your mic there.
There's a tendering website. Yep. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay. We have another question. Yeah, walk away. Yeah.
Thank you. I wonder, would you mind expanding on the concept of, or the steps involved in policy evaluation?
So, this is from our, so I suppose policy evaluation could take many forms, right? So sometimes there'll be a commissioned piece of research to evaluate a particular policy. So that some new policy is introduced, a couple of years after it's been in place, the relevant department might say, okay, now we want to evaluate it. Is it working? So is it meeting its stated objectives, whatever those objectives are? Are there any unintended consequences that we sort of didn't consider when we implemented the policy? And is there anything we can do to make it work better? So that, you know, those are typically the things that they're interested in finding out.
Yeah, and is this on? Yeah, and I think if you think about policy evaluation, like any research study, you know what I mean? It depends on the questions you're trying to answer. You know, it might be a mixed method study. You know, the researchers are actually often in a good place to do policy evaluation, be it like independent or, you know, commissioned or whatever. But like it might be a qualitative, you know, study. You know, might be, you know, they might be doing focus groups with service users or, you know, civil servants. They might be doing surveys. You know, they might be analysing data. You know, it could be qual, mixed method. So if you think about policy evaluation as, you know, as a type of research study, and that's certainly somewhere that, you know, I think a lot of, you know, academics can certainly contribute quite well with their research hats on.
There's one small tension in the policy evaluation space is that government departments tend not to give a lot of money for the policy evaluation piece. So as an academic, you're kind of constantly thinking about, is this worth my while? This might be my space. I'll give an example. Myself and Professor Stephen Gallagher and a PhD student here, Aoife Bowman-Grangel, had done work in the young carer space, and we published a number of papers on young carers, and really interesting research. And then recently a call came from the department around young carers, so expanding on the definition of young carers, looking at their needs and so on. And it would have been a great opportunity for us to, you know, continue that work, but the money that they were offering was really small, and both myself and Stephen looked at it, and in the end we decided we weren't going to go for it. But at the same time, it would have been a great opportunity to kind of solidify the research that we'd done in that area and really bring it together. So we didn't go for it that time, but it is a good example of how you have to think as well, is this the right thing for me at the right time? But policy evaluation can help bring research that you've already done to make it visible at a national level, where you can influence policy. So even if your own research doesn't directly do it, it can be the springboard to obtaining something like that. But there is that, often there's not very much money involved. It's more prestige and visibility and impact than it is financial. So there is that tension between the two pieces.
Yep, go ahead.
Professional associations, okay, there'll always be a professional association. They'll always have information officers and experts handling the flow and handling the flow of information and handling their own policies as well. The EU agencies, don't leave those guys out of account. Any chance you get to take a visit to an EU agency, please take it. I was at the chemical agency in Helsinki. Phenomenal work, 600 scientists and policymakers all tucked in doing the business. So that kind of social knowledge is absolutely vital. The MEPs are always sitting on committees, as the civil servants are as well, okay? So you'll build a relationship with all of these. Right now, Maria Walsh is working on rape as a crime across Europe. So that's her policy zone. So get to know all of those folks, and they will work with you as well.
And just say we will talk about the European space next. Jenny's going to talk about that.
I just wanted to add to what Patty was saying, because you're right, because I am at the European level shaping development policy, for example, and been invited to the United Nations Environment Programme for the foresight on where Europe is going with its environment. This was a couple of years back. So you see your name there on that list, but you may not be attributed directly because it's an entire cohort of scholars and practitioners working together.
Very good.
So yeah, those are the things.
We have another question over here as well. Just while the mic is making its way, I see lots of people putting here on their stakeholders, members of the public, and let's not forget members of the public. It's a really important stakeholder and is a good reason to consider speaking to the media if at all appropriate for your research area. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question, I suppose, and you talked around the policy implementation side of things. So I'm in the Chemie Business School and my area of research is healthcare, so I'm kind of straddling, you know, I suppose two disciplines, which is, it's hard to get funding in that area, but when you do get funding, it comes usually from the Midwest itself. And I just wondered about your advice. So I would be looking at the implementation of policy from the HSE, but my research would be within the Midwest. So the findings, when they're not overly positive, you feel, so I'm wondering, how do you get over when the findings are very negative about how they've implemented policy within a particular, I suppose, space? How do you present that from a national perspective, or do you have any examples of that? Because it's very hard to show how maybe negatively it's been implemented and then present that at a national conference. You know, it's tricky because you're kind of biting the hand that fed you, you know, and then when I go back in and look for access, it's very hard, you know, to do that. I don't know if you have any experience of that or how you circumvent that, or...
It's a great question. It's very tricky. I don't know, does anyone else want to have a crack at that first, or...?
I can speak to the experience of working in the youth mental health space, where we're working closely with policymakers, youth mental health researchers, young people and the charities and NGOs. And I suppose there is a kind of a fairly close relationship between all of them. And it is a balancing act, because obviously you want to stay within the circle so that you have an opportunity to influence when the time arises and not to alienate. But you have a duty, obviously, to report your files. So oftentimes it's a framing exercise. And as Karina said, making sure that the policymakers have an opportunity to hear the information before everybody else and, you know, have an opportunity to think about how they're going to respond to that. That's one thing you can do. The second thing is, you know, how you frame the findings. Most people in general are trying to do a really good job. They're trying their best to work in a system that sometimes is broken. So how you frame findings can be really important, that you're not pointing a finger, but more you're highlighting issues within the system. So I think it's just ways that you can kind of mitigate the...
That's how we would frame it. So, but we have a big paper coming out, quite a big paper with photographs. But we tried to frame it. It's actually the national policy that created the problems, but it's still photographs of their waiting rooms and their, you know, structures. I just wondered...
I think policymakers are more and more aware of unintended consequences of policy making as well, and where the gaps are, and oftentimes how poorly resourced well-intentioned policy is. So, you know, you might always, sometimes you'll find that it's useful to them actually to get something new over the line.
I think I might just add to that. I mean, it's a difficult situation, but it's about working with your stakeholders and your colleagues, and, you know, even just kind of like, you know, giving them the information earlier, going back to no surprises, you know, maybe giving them an early draft of it, you know, maybe there, you might be able to meet not somewhere in the middle, but, you know, there might be some language, you know, things that can, you know, even if you're still saying the same thing, but maybe you're saying it in a slightly different way. So it's a bit more, you know, because even something that you mightn't find, you know, might upset someone completely unintentionally, but you still want to get the core facts. You know, like, you're not changing your findings, but maybe slightly the framing. So maybe just working earlier draft, let them in, you know, no surprises, I think, is kind of, you know, because you think about, you will be working with them again in the future as well, and you have to maintain those relationships, and that's something that's really important. And sometimes, you know, it's like what's the real challenge here? Like, what are we fighting? Is it just this battle, or is it the war? You know, and I think it is, you know, thinking to the future as well. You don't want to damage any relationships too much.
What I've tried to do to get ahead of it is a systematic review. So we're looking at the 5/7 move in healthcare. You know, the move from 5-day to 7-day. We're doing a systematic review to show what's out there before we get in and do the research in. So in other words, what'll happen is a product of the lack of evidence in that move. So I've tried to do it that way. I just find it's difficult to stay with partners when you're kind of saying, even though policy are driving the problems, you're still taking pictures of their organisation, and it's tricky.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, if this is a serious problem, in my experience, the policy, they already know. Like, they're living it. They're aware of this problem, and, you know, sometimes they need the evidence to go out there for, you know, somebody to say, okay, let's fix this, and for them to get the resources to fix it. So often, even though it's kind of difficult for them, they're glad that it is happening at the same time. But it is definitely a tricky situation. I think I don't have anything much else to add to that. Yeah.
Thanks. I suppose just following up on that example, and to add just a little bit more attention to it, when I suppose the issue that you're highlighting and reporting on is picked up by opposition parties. So not, I suppose, the intended audience, the people that, you know, are creating policy, but across the aisle. So how do you navigate that tension?
I mean, I'd probably argue they are stakeholders too. You know, they have a job to do in pushing government to be better, to do better, to be more accountable. So, I mean, sometimes the tactics are not what you would use to push your research. But I just don't think you can control that, really. Coming back to the no surprises thing, just make sure everyone's aware before the opposition pick up on it. I think is the only thing you can do there. You know, I wouldn't. Yeah, I mean, it can make a tricky situation more tense. But at the same time, if it gives an issue that needs to be highlighted more airtime, then maybe it's a necessary evil.
I think your brand is really important too as a researcher, that you're seen as somebody who's looking to be established in your area and have built a profile, and that you're not emotively going around throwing your research, but you found this and these are your findings and you stand over them. For example, Karina, you work at the ESRI, and I know the ESRI, they would publish a lot of research, particularly in the youth mental health space, that would be quite detrimental to current governments and what they're doing and what they're achieving with young people. But it's just delivered in a very kind of no-nonsense way, and opposition parties would pick it up quite frequently. But it doesn't stop the researchers within the ESRI or the ESRI itself being seen as a kind of a space for research and good, robust research. So I think it's about trying to establish your brand that's neutral to whatever stakeholder you're working with, but is trying to support all stakeholders by disseminating good research. And over time, I think you as you go on, you will just be seen as that if you continue to publish in that field, regardless of who picks up on the research. Because, for example, charities often pick up on research and they will use it to really go after like a minister or go after a government policy. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be viewed negatively by those policymakers. In actual fact, it might draw attention to the fact that you're really good in this area, and that, you know, future tenders or things like that, they might look favourably on you as somebody who's able to do research in this field. So it is tricky, and I think as researchers we often feel it very personally. But I think one thing about being in the Young Academy, you start to kind of see things a little bit more objectively, that actually it's just about doing good research and disseminating to as wide a variety of sources as possible. But, you know, just doing that with as much integrity as you can, and whatever happens, happens, you know.
I guess it kind of speaks to the importance of being part of a network, really, yes. Because I suppose there is a safety. There is a safety in kind of, whether it's the ESRI or whether it's, you know, an NGO or, you know,
or a group.
You know, that you're kind of a member of that, or you're within that, I suppose, space, rather than an independent early career researcher.
You can be quite vulnerable in that space.
Out, trying to publish a policy paper or something like that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Thanks. I'm going to follow on that point, and I'm coming at this from the research communication side of the house, and we have seen examples of researchers who the publicity on their research has brought a lot of attention on them personally and been really, really challenging, and impacted then relationships, would say, within the organisation or outside. So the thing I would say to people is, engage early with the support networks within the organisation. So your research communications or any communications professionals or anybody on strategic planning, senior leadership, they're all there to help and advise on that, and they have seen it before. So having them briefed, I think, would be very beneficial.
I might just totally agree with that. Our communications team in HIQA are a lifesaver. So they proofread everything before it goes out. Press release, infographics, you know. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said. I know not everyone is blessed with such a network, but having someone to make sure that your message is what, as intended, goes out. Obviously, to a certain degree, sometimes you can't control it to, you know, but like as in, from our perspective, success is when the newspapers are literally lifting your press release. You know what I mean? They're saying exactly what you want them to say. But obviously sometimes, you know, because especially for the more complex topics, and the research is becoming more and more complex across the field and stuff, there's no way around it, but it is about getting a simple message. What are you trying to get across? And it is about reputation building as well. Like, who is your spokesperson? You know, are the media familiar with them? You know, it can be challenging for a new independent person, but certainly comms team, if you have access to one, use it.
And media training, if you have access to media training at all, I'd highly recommend it. It's good for everything. It doesn't have to be for talking to the media. I think we had another question down the front here. Sorry. You've had your hand up for a while. I had missed you.
Yeah, they've covered all the points I was going to make. Just two questions. One was, how do you communicate with these people? Do you build up a personal relationship so that they come back to you, or they come back to you at the start? And how do you get to know them? Is that through public consultations or through introductions? Or, you know, you're sort of basically on your own? That's number one. And number two, as you were saying, do you sort of rewrite your research to be more, or to have a frame of it so that it's more accessible, you know, and it's sort of, it's ready, you know, to be introduced into policy?
Great questions. Okay, so how do you get to know them? So I think that's probably one of the biggest issues that researchers, and particularly early career researchers, face. They have no idea who to contact to promote their research. So at Young Academy Ireland, we're starting an evidence for policy network. So get the plug in now, okay? So you're all invited to join our evidence for policy network. We're going to, we've held a couple of events in the past. We're going to keep holding events. We'll be hopefully doing something on the policy cycle, trying to bring early career researchers together with relevant policy makers in order to start creating those networks, right? So that people start to get to know people in their area. I think it's probably the same for policymakers, particularly early career policymakers. They don't know where to go for research, right? So it's really important to build up those relationships early if you can at all, but most people don't know where to start. So, you know, lots of departments host events, conferences. Sometimes they're open to the public or to researchers. You can go along to them, see if you can get talking to people who are working in your area. I mean, advice we got when we attended the Civil Service Research Network was, if you have something that you want to disseminate in a particular department, just go on the website, find I forget what job title they told us to go, was a PO and above, find a PO and just send it to them and hope for the best. You just never know. If it's something that's going to be useful to them, they'll get back to you. So that's not an easy question to answer, particularly because there's so much movement in the civil service. So somebody you get to know might be gone to another department next year or the year after. So it's not easy. So that's something that people tend to have to work at. One of you want to take the other question on framing?
Can you repeat the second question?
I can find it. Do you rewrite your research or have that in mind to sort of simplify it and make it more accessible, so that it'll be useful and it'll be seen, it'll be understood?
Absolutely is the answer. Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, it's policy briefs, it's one pagers, it's, you know, at most 2 pagers, you know, it's you know, infographics, you know. Again, if you have a comms team or access to a comms team, or you know, policy brief training is brilliant, because it is about distilling quite complex messages into, you know, key points and key actions and stuff like that. Again, it's the skill in doing that, you know. But absolutely, I mean, I think we had a debate about whether civil servants actually read academic papers or not. Some do and some don't. I think it just really depends, you know, but it's going down to people are busy, you know, it's not necessarily their area of expertise. You know, they're civil servants, they're moving from department to department, so their background might be not in the area that they're working in and stuff. So you have to kind of meet them where they're at. So anything to help get that message across, for sure. And then if they want more information, they can contact you. But you have to get in the door with your policy brief.
Just when you see something that you really disagree with, you know, that's complete. I don't know, like prison works was one of the sayings that was made in politics in the UK, and it wasn't working, you know. And sort of how do you know, it's almost propaganda that comes out in policy making. How do you counter that?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, policy is political, you know what I mean? The two are interconnected, and, you know, so it's, you know, I suppose there's a bit of campaigning at your local TDs as well and stuff like that as well. You know, there's probably it's not necessarily even just research, but I mean, it's a hard one to answer, but a lot of things that are said are just, you know, the government of the day are saying things because that's
and sometimes I think it's up to researchers to just stay on message, you know, like to keep repeating things that we've said in the past, and eventually when that public lighthouse comes around, somebody might listen this time. And you know, that's I mean, a lot of the discussion has been about this, about your brand as a researcher, your identity, your independence, keeping that independence and impartiality as much as possible. And continuing to deliver your message, even if it looks like policy is going in the other direction, if you have the evidence to back it up. Okay, so we're over to Kieran next, again.
So thanks, Karina. I think this is actually a nice segue into just a quick, recap of our Evidence for Policy Summit. I'll put it, that full slideshow there, great. So this is our Evidence for Policy Summit that Young Academy Ireland hosted back in September. I think what we discuss here today is a real, translating is really highlights why we did it. Translating evidence into policy is a persistent challenge, both for researchers and policymakers alike, and it's particularly true for early career researchers who might be at the forefront of research in their discipline, but yet maybe the most removed from policymakers, best place to translate this evidence into action. This isn't just a problem unique to Ireland, it's quite universal actually in the literature. So we sought to kind of start to address this challenge by bringing together a diverse group of policymakers and ECRs from across the island of Ireland to explore how we can improve the collaboration between policymakers and ECRIs working on policy relevant topics across the island. So start the conversation really. So just some nice photos there, and myself, Jenny and Karina, and amongst others were on the organising committee. So it was a really great day and we hope to replicate it. Just some brief insights from the day. So all the information, if people are interested, there's a full recording on Young Academy Ireland's website and on our YouTube page. So we had the keynote was Professor Michael Sanders, very interesting, a keynote. He's Professor of Public Policy and Director of the School of Government at King's College London. So he kind of discussed his kind of experiences of having impact as a researcher, and it was quite interesting. He kind of talked about it's not just necessarily doing the research, it's about knocking on doors, becoming friends with people. It's about advocating. It's about putting just putting your boots on and getting to work. And it's kind of beyond it's beyond just doing the research. It's kind of for some people it's implementing as well, and also de-implementing. It's about stopping maybe policies or advocating for policies to be stopped if the evidence say they don't work. So that was a really good rousing start to the day. We then had a really great panel, which was expertly chaired by Jenny. It was on the topic of ECRIs and policy on our shared island. So we had researchers and senior civil servants from across the island, Professor Alan Barr from ESRI, Sarah Burke, Trinity College Dublin, Dr. Jonathan Dalzell, who is the Department of Agriculture and Rural Affairs and the Environment in the North, and Leona Harshey, Department of Civil Servant, Department of Further and Higher Education, Research and Innovation. So really good discussion there, and this is really where the debates were had about is there a tension between policymakers and research, or is it kind of just all made up? But it was a really interesting debate, and it was talking about do policymakers have time to read academic papers or not, and just the kind of the intricacies of how policy is made and stuff, and differences north and south, and similarities as well, and then I suppose complexities of the different governments and so on. So it was a really interesting panel discussion. And then we kind of the next part of the day, then we had some really interesting kind of case examples from some of our fellow Young Academy Ireland members. So Dr. Maeve O'Rourke, Andrea Cerbuccio, Derva Kelly, Jenny McMahon, Niall Farrell and Deirdre Robertson. So provide examples of just how ECRs can produce evidence that informs policy across a diverse range of areas. So it was a broad range of topics. It was linguistics, it was youth mental health, it was drug addiction, law, human rights, behaviour change, energy poverty. So really good mix. I think actually interesting. I think that was, people said that was their favourite part of the day. So that was good. And I suppose the main focus, and I think what we learned so much from is we had kind of like a discussion, a round table, I suppose, of where we kind of mix ECRs and policymakers together to kind of try and see how can we bridge this gap, what are the challenges, how can we move forward. And I suppose there was three main learnings for us, and one, again, I think you've discussed a lot of these issues, but one is definitely a need for capacity building among both ECRs and policymakers. There's an acknowledgement that a knowledge gap exists for sure. For example, how is policy constructed, how high quality research is undertaken, how best to communicate the findings, and to the right, and who to, I suppose. And again, there was a suggestion that maybe there could be a way to publish and circulate, so kind of centralised kind of government department research priorities on a regular basis, so people are aware of what actually do the government of the day want to know about. And the need for networking, definitely there was felt a disconnect between policymakers and ECRs. a strong support for a centralised network where policymakers could reach out to a list of ECRs for specific questions and vice versa, where ECRs could proactively disseminate findings from their research. So networking events, an evidence for policy network that we're trying to construct, and knowledge brokers felt to be quite important, And finally, I suppose just a need for better funding and more structured supports from universities and governments was advocated for. In order to sustain efforts, there needs to be a commitment to make this a priority area. There's no point saying, oh yeah, it's important, but we're not going to sustain it. We're not going to provide sufficient funding. We're not going to reward it either financially or non-financially or some way. More bespoke funding for networks, and acknowledging the impact of policy engagement and publishing research priorities for research governments, because, there's definitely an asymmetry going on, and definitely it's not being done consistently. Some government departments are actually quite good at publishing priorities. I think the Department for Climate and Energy, that one, they've recently published research priorities, so it's definitely on their website, and it's a very interesting read, and it's a very good read for anyone working in that space. So we're just going to have, I believe this is the final Menti of the day. So if you want to just chat, there's 2 questions there. First is, what are the barriers to engage with your key stakeholders? And the second one is, what are the enablers to engage with key stakeholders? And I think some of the discussions today might have maybe changed some of your mind. Maybe you've realised there's more barriers now, but hopefully there's some enabler maybe that can help you, get your research out there. So I'll give this like maybe a minute or 2. Yeah.
I think try and make it bespoke to you, so that you're really thinking about literally not the broad barriers.
Microphone.
Sorry, think about not the barriers more broadly or the enablers more broadly. Think about your own barriers, because everyone here will have a different barrier depending on where they are in their career. And think about your own enabler, and an immediate enabler that you might have that could open a door for you or help you to access the policy path.
Okay, our answers coming in there, Jenny. Yeah, great. Okay, I'll flick over to. I think I've messed up. I think I'm on the wrong. That's right. Oh yeah, I see. Yeah, sorry. Technology. Yeah. Okay, so we're starting to get some answers in, but maybe we can use this to provoke some discussion. So what are the barriers to engagement with your key stakeholders? We have, funders, challenging to get engagement, willingness to consult appropriately, funding, time, accessibility, absolutely, contact and forums, carving out time, having a team speaking the language to ensure the implications of your research are understood, access, platform seen as an implementer versus designer strategy, access, lack of awareness of representative stakeholders for your discipline, funding, definitely funding is an important theme there. Time, stakeholders are time poor, absolutely. Flexibility is key, but this can also impact timelines, I agree. And if timelines are progressed so much, your research doesn't become relevant for policy, so there is definitely a tension there. Anyone want to kind of add any reflections on that, I suppose, just even verbally?
Seem to be coming out as really important.
Yeah, and I think that's quite universal. Yeah, absolutely.
I think one thing that within the space is the recognition by universities of the time that goes into this. So for promotions and career progression, increasingly there's a focus on impact in the wider research ecosystem. So I think that has to be mirrored at the university level, where it's not, and it goes back to that conversation around DORA and things like that, that it's not all about citations and number of papers, it's about the impact of those and the engagement of your research with this broader research ecosystem. And I think that is taking time to trickle down as well, and that can be frustrating to people who are working solidly in the space as well. The funding piece, I think, is, I don't know if that will ever change. Yeah, it's hard when you don't have funding. But what is really good is that a lot of these big funders now, they do want this policy engagement. And even, for example, working on a Horizon project with Professor Fiona Farr, she's leading a submission to Horizon at the moment that I'm supporting, but they're looking for policy advisors to be involved at the outset of the project. So it is hugely important. And if you have already those connections, it's going to be easier for you to be able to bring those people on board. So it is a space that you kind of have to engage with if you're going after these bigger grants. And even the smaller grants with Research Ireland, they're all looking for policy impact as well. So I suppose it is something that as researchers we kind of have to get more engagement with. But there has to be a recognition across the board that this work is kind of time consuming as well, and changing your outputs for different audiences, and having these meetings and these engagements, like they're all part of our research work, but they take a lot of time. It'd be much easier to hold yourself up and right away than have to do all this kind of external engagement. And it's really hard for some people actually, because some people aren't as versed in maybe engaging with it. Maybe some people aren't from Ireland, for example, as well, and you're going out and you're trying to first of all understand the Irish context, but then also figure out who's important in the Irish context. So for different people it'll even be harder again. So I think there has to be a kind of a unified recognition of the work in the space.
Yeah, and I would say going on funding, I mean, there are some positive developments. I think the Research Ireland, I think they're called Public Service Fellowships, really good initiative to get, I suppose, researchers embedded in, public sector bodies and government departments. I think that's a really positive move, even just to make those connections. We'll move on to the enablers. Okay, less enablers. None, is it? Okay.
Talk about the enablers there. Yeah. I'm as bad as other people. Does anyone want to mention some of the enablers that they personally have? As obviously we had you earlier speaking about the fact that it's built into your funding, and so you obviously have mechanisms there to translate your research into policy or get to the policy makers.
I think we can't. It takes kind of few years to kind of build the relationship or engaging with the stakeholders. My first project, which was funded by Irish Cancer Society, we started working about what can we do to for the cancer patients to so that they will give up the smoking for the smoking cessation program. Like we have the smoking cessation program, but then there is no good uptake. So, we started with that project and then reached out to the National Cancer Control Program, and they listened to what we found. There is no sort of overnight kind of thing. So you'll slowly build with that. The first step, as soon as you clear the first step, reaching out to whoever the policymakers are, that would be really good. I suppose this research week, I got an opportunity to pitch one of my research about the household air pollution. So I published a funny article about house burping. I don't know if you guys have seen on the conversation. So I suppose I gave it a different angle to that study to catch the attention of public. So I got kind of 75 readers, and then I pitched that article, kind of showed that article to Department of Health, and I said, we really need to kind of do something. So, look out for the opportunities where you can kind of go and pitch, and this gentleman was kind of mentioning that how do we exactly translate our research? So, you just have to kind of think differently and see what are their opportunities and how we can kind of reach out to the people and the TDs and whoever the policymakers are, isn't it?
I think our comms team here are superb, and they've really upped their game in the last 5 years, 10 years. Whoever's working there, they're just absolutely brilliant. And I know several colleagues who've been approached based on research. The comms team have approached them to write articles or do pieces for The Conversation or Psychology Today, or even pieces within the Examiner. And then colleagues have been approached on foot of those pieces in the paper by TDs or by policymakers because it's caught their eye, and they're like, they want to find out more. So you're right, like just even those pieces around the conversation, they're great.
I published another article with the same topic. It was about toxic air in your homes, and it wasn't kind of successful. But then I gave a different angle with the house burping, and even I got an interview in New Zealand radio to talk about it.
Excellent. Perseverance.
So, it went cross-border.
So that's a great attribute that is an enabler, so that persistent quality of try again.
Great. Do we have any other neighbours? I mean, I think, we've kind of, we know all the barriers and stuff. I think knowing your audience, I think that was a good, and maybe trying things slightly differently next time around. I think learning from, past endeavours for sure, establishing networks. Please.
Just one enabler I found is actually doing a kind of action-based research. So instead of just showing them, I suppose, what's wrong through the research, is carrying out research that can help and support. So some of the work I do, the action research was actually developing people through the process of the research. And because of that, actually that drove then me getting a much bigger grant in terms of what I'm looking at. So the enabler was partnering with them rather than just going in, taking the research and coming out and publishing, but to actually say, well, how can we change the narrative? And then as a result, I got bigger funding because of that. And that was a big enabler just for me.
Great. We might just take one question then and we'll move on to the last couple of slides. Thanks very much.
This is a weird enabler, but use the right research methodology. Like, we are really used to doing evidence synthesis, systematic reviews, but the minister might talk to a realist review, right? Or to an integrative review, bringing two disciplines together, right? Rapid review flew into people's attention during COVID. We're very slow, right? I could count on one finger the number of times I've been asked for gap analysis, in the library. And it's a massive technique. It's fantastic, and it really speaks to a future rather than a past.
I think, Patty, that's great advice. My own research is in youth mental health, young people's well-being. And I'm an applied researcher, so in some ways I've always been out there engaging with stakeholders and hopefully helping to influence the system I'm in. But it was 2020 in COVID when I took on doing this coast-based study, which is tracking young people and their families throughout the COVID pandemic for well-being. And it was a collaborative partnership with other countries. That was my first kind of real instinct around how you engage with policy. So I kind of sensed the importance of this straight away because, like, as Karina pointed out, it was an emergency. There wasn't very much happening in the space. I reached out to a number of policymakers and people in government, and I had such great responses. They were inputting in terms of the questions that we were putting into the survey. They were hosting us on the government, i.e. site for parents. I did real-time reports for them from the study rather than waiting for research to come out. They were using them to inform their policy. It was cited by ESRI. The actual real-time reports were cited by the ESRI, which of course directly influenced policy in the government. And I suppose it was a real introduction as to how your research, when you hit that window of how it can have a strong impact, but identifying those gaps is super important, but being able to respond quickly, I suppose we've all kind of emphasised that today, and that is always the struggle as a researcher because we like to take our time with things, and sometimes we have to take our time, and it's collecting data, etc. So yeah, I think that's really helpful, and the library is such a huge resource, Patty, that I think we underutilise in some ways, but maybe you don't want any more people to be coming at your door. Yeah. So we've been here for quite a while, so I really kind of want to get into this last piece, which I think is I suppose I have been working in a policy space, but being in the Young Academy has really introduced me to it in a more concrete way, a more strategic way as well, in terms of my thinking about how my own research field and my own research interacts with policy. And then more recently, I'm an executive member of the Young Academy, and I got the opportunity to go to a space called ENIA, which I'll explain in a minute. And as part of that, they have this piece of work called YASIS, the Young Academy Science Advice Structure. And I was appointed as an executive member to the YASIS last year. And I suppose that has really introduced me to a whole other space in Europe that I really knew very little about. And I suppose in my academic career, sometimes I've wondered, how do you interact with European policy? And I suppose in more and more, our policy in Ireland is set in Europe. And I suppose in order to kind of set the agenda in Ireland, you want to really be engaging with European policy. So I suppose the scenario here is that up to about 20% of public decisions in Europe are informed by systematic evidence. So that leaves 80% of the decisions that are uninformed by evidence. And we know that those policy cycles move faster than the research. So EU quickly, they established that you needed concrete structures in order to bridge this gap between the research and the policy piece. And so they formally institutionalised this science advice relationship in 2015. So they created this formal mechanism rather than up until that point they had been responding to kind of ad hoc requests, or they had been initiating ad hoc requests to which researchers could contribute. So they created this kind of structure called SAPEA, and SAPEA is an entity that brings European academies together to synthesise evidence for commissioners. So SAPEA itself is comprised of several different institutions, and it's designed to be able to be a conduit for that policy to practice, our research to practice piece. YASIS is what I'm part of. It gives early and mid-career researchers a seat at the EU policy table, because several of the other institutions are senior academies, and so that would mean people who are towards the very end of their career, or even post their career. So they might be retired, and they were really the people that were getting the opportunity to feed into these EU advice mechanisms. So YASIS really starts to bring the early career person in and the mid-career person into the conversation. The Young Academy of Ireland is the gateway that Ireland has to engage with YASIS. And I suppose that's one thing that can feel a little bit, like a closed shop, is that like the academies, they really do have their own conversation and dialogue. So for example, when you're in an academy, so for example, the Royal Irish Academy, which a lot of senior people would be in close to their late stage of career, they would get invites to contribute to a lot of things through the academy. They don't get circulated to the everyday researcher, and that can kind of feel like, so it can be difficult to break into. YASIS is the same. We work through the academy structure. There's young academies in almost many countries around the world, and we have global young academies and European young academies. And again, things get fed through that. I'll talk to you in a little minute about what I'm involved in, which is around breaking out of those cliques, breaking out of just the academy structure, so that other researchers that do really good research can contribute to these mechanisms as well. I do talk a little bit about why it matters for the career, because I suppose we touched on it earlier, but I suppose funders like Horizon Europe, they're increasingly rewarding these impact pathways that look at the engagement with policymakers. And we know Ireland's Impact 2030 strategy also calls for this greater public policy researcher connectivity. Increasingly, the policy citations and science advice contributions do count in research assessment structures. And I suppose participation in things like SAPEA and YASIS, they help to generate these open access pieces. They help to widen your research. They create transdisciplinary networks and interdisciplinary networks, which are really useful. And if you engage within the research policy space, the things that you will get is you get those that understanding around rapid evidence synthesis across disciplines, and work with other researchers, because generally these big societal challenges, they don't just require one discipline or one lens in order to answer them. They generally require several disciplines to come together. And I suppose that's a space that is, it's a learned skill set to engage with other researchers in the field as well. You learn about science communication. So a big thing that we focus on in the Young Academy and in YASIS is this piece around science communication. And we are working a lot with journalists whose speciality is science communication. And so we've had workshops from them about how to actually structure your research to feed to them, so they can communicate out in their science advice articles. And that piece around interdisciplinary collaboration and European networking as well is so important to these. So how does this science advice mechanism work, the SAM, which is the shorthand version for it? So this is how it works. You have the European Commission. The European Commission requests and receives advice, okay? So they will have issues of the day that they're looking for information on. This will be fed down to the SAM Secretariat, which is essentially the body that, you know, does all the meetings, or does the minutes, it engages in the calls and things like that. And they house the coordination and support unit for research and innovation. So we have two structures then that feed out from the SAM Secretariat. The first one is a group of chief scientific advisors. These scientific advisors, you may have seen calls to them occasionally. They do tend to come through the academies, but they would be in other spaces as well. And these are 7 eminent scientists appointed in a personal capacity. People apply for it, they put in their CVs. They're generally senior people in their field. The 7 will be drawn from different disciplines and might be related to topics that are of high interest at the time. And their job is to produce scientific opinions for the commissioners. So they might get a call from the European Commission, we want something on climate change, for example, and the chief scientific advisor will have to draw up a report that will feed directly into that. There are some of the recent topics which I'll go into a little bit more detail on. On the other side of this is what we call SAPEA, and SAPEA is made up of 6 European academy networks, including EASIS, which I'll name in a few moments, and their job then is to produce peer-reviewed evidence review reports and give them to the chief scientific advisors, and they will feed them back up. They will use that as part of the report and feed back into the EU Commission. And so since its establishment in 2016, there's been 15 plus reports developed by SAPEA to feed into the chief scientific advisors. So how it works is the first thing they do is they set the policy question. So what will happen then next is that we'll get that from that formal request from SAM. SAPEA will assemble 15 to 25 European experts, all right? And this will include early career researchers. So there is a composition that they have to attain in order to do this. Most of those calls go out through the academies and they look for researchers through the academies. Then they come together to do the rapid systematic review across 12 to 18 months, and usually there's multiple disciplines within that. This then will go out to public consultation where people will have an opportunity to feed in, and Karina mentioned that earlier on. This is also a good opportunity if you're not part of that 25 to feed in maybe your thoughts, but also open to the public, which is your European citizen. And then they'll produce an open access report, which is a peer-reviewed scientific output of which you'll have been a contributor to. And then the chief scientific advisors will use the report as an evidence base for their recommendations back to the Commission. So here's a nice infographic that you can take a picture of. It's also on an EU website, but sure, who will ever be able to find it on one of the EU websites? So take the opportunity to take a photo of it while you can. And you can see here just the flow of information that I've just discussed there and how it works and results in policy and policy change and legislation. Hope you've all had a chance. Okay, so just to give you a taste of the kind of open access reports that have been done in the last number of years. So you can see here the first one, a sustainable food system for the EU, was done in 2020, all looking at the kind of farm to table food strategy. So that was, you know, obviously if you were working in that area, that was a really important opportunity for you to engage with the European policy on that. Then we had strategic crisis management in the EU in 2022, and that was kind of in the middle of that COVID-19 emergency, looking at the Ukraine conflict as well, and then also the climate emergency. And that was all about like how we send out early warnings through the EU, and also kind of that preparedness piece, which I don't know if you've been kind of following, but you can see that that did filter down into our research funders, where there was research funding around preparedness recently. So all of those things would have stemmed from some of this work in 2022. Then obviously this new call in 2024 around AI in science, again, if that was your area, you were primed to kind of meet a call around this piece. And this was about advising commissioners on AI in research and recommending a new European Institute for AI in Science. And then we also had like the biodegradability of plastics in 2020. So really diverse topics there in terms of what the EU were looking for, but also they're meeting those big societal challenges, aren't they? They're really looking at those kind of big issues. So in terms of EASIS, so I'm on the executive member of EASIS. I've been on it for about a year, and it's really been an eye-opener, and I'm really lucky that I've been invited to chair inequality, diversity and inclusion strategy as part of EASIS, but it's actually the strategy for SAPEA, which is the overarching body. But EASIS are taking up the driving of the work, but it's feeding into this broad umbrella. And I love doing this work because it's all about making sure that a diverse range of researcher has a seat at the table in terms of feeding into EU policy. So one of the things that we're working on through this EDI policy is making sure that calls are maybe publicly available so people can self-nominate rather than just coming through the academies. Also making sure that maybe things that how even the meetings are run to make sure that early career researchers have a voice and feel that they're respected when they sit at the table. So making sure that people have facilitation training and things like that. And also making sure that we focus on countries who are underrepresented at those meetings, and also gender issues as well. So making sure that that women are also at the table when the decision making is happening as well. So it's giving me a lovely opportunity to shape how EU policy is made, which I think is quite exciting for me, and also for Ireland to be able to kind of have this opportunity, because I suppose I'm the first member from Ireland to be able to sit on IASAS because the YAI is so new. So here's one of the pieces that we did. We were at a General Assembly in Bern. That was really great. I went to the Einstein Museum, and there's sometimes academia is not glamorous, and it's but sometimes you go to something you're like, this is cool. This is like something I really want to do and I'm passionate about. So that was a really great opportunity to meet lots of very good people working in the area of EU policy. And just to kind of emphasise how the YAI Ireland links to the European Science Advice. We have put out a call last year. We have 20 new people come in. There will be rolling calls to join the YAI. It's every 2. I think we have another call in 2 years for another 20, and then after that it'll be every 2 years for a rolling cohort of 40 to join. So what we want is a 60 members at any given point, and it is competitive. And it is difficult, but if the people that are here today, like you're already thinking about this, the YAI really emphasises your impact on society, your engagement with policy. So if you're already thinking about it, you're already going to be like primed to be to make a really strong application to something like the YAI. You can join the YAI, and if you are part of that, you obviously get to engage in IASAS. But even beyond that, people in the YAI also get to engage in different ways. They sit on committees, etc. Other people get asked to join a SAPEA working group. So that's the broader body that makes up the 6 different bodies within SAPEA. They often look for calls for the working group. So it's trying to find out where you can access those calls. That could be discipline specific. It could be something that you need to be on. It could be a website. It could be a group, a network you need to join. That will be discipline specific. But they do put out calls for those working groups, obviously contribute to the evidence. And one thing I will say here is it's very unlikely that any of us will ever have a direct line to making a policy change, right? And I think that's okay. Big societal challenges require lots of voices. If your research can help in some way, that is the important thing. It doesn't have to, your research doesn't have to be this so big that you are the only person who can solve this big societal challenge. And I would say that sometimes can be quite overwhelming as a researcher. It's like, why is my voice important? But I suppose it's the many voices and the collective that's really important. So why does this matter for our career? I do think this is an important conversation for us as researchers. Why should we give so much time over to this? Because it is quite an engagement. We do need to do it. It's all about research engagement. The European Research Area Policy also commits member states to recognise science advice as career output. So that's important for us to know. We have these pathways to Horizon Europe and so on. SAPEA, for example, it generates those open access publications. We want to do it, we need to do it, but there is a skills gap. We know that 74% of early career researchers lack the structures or the confidence to do it. So hopefully today is a stepping stone to helping support people to get those skills and the confidence. And we're also working at a European level to try and address those as well. So there's going to be lots of different trainings available. So you can keep an eye out for those. I joined one last year, an EU one, which was amazing. It had trainings every month where you joined and you got expertise on lots of different things, from science communication to policy making, etc., and join some international networks which will position you to take advantage of these calls as well. I've given some advice here just for every stage is different, and I suppose for an early career researcher I think it can be quite daunting, but you don't have to do it all at once. A career is like a long piece of string, and you will be able for and expected to do things at different points along your career stage. So make sure you're not trying to bite off more than you can chew at the stage of career that you're at. So for example, if you're early career, it could be about connecting with your academy, joining a network, attending events. More down the line, mid-career, you could be nominating yourself to working groups where you're more confident in your research, or you have more of a breadth of research to draw on. Later on, at senior lecturer, associate professor level, you might be in the YAI, you might have other colleagues that you're working on in an interdisciplinary way, you might be representing people at different events. And I suppose no matter what stage you are, it doesn't matter, you can start now, and I suppose that's a really important message. Some people will have a head start, other people might be just catching up to it. In late stage, career stage, I kind of fell into this midway through my career, but it's never too late, and it's always the right time to start thinking about your strategic pathway into influencing policy. So hopefully you have some key takeaways around using your research to influence policy from today. You all have your action plan. Hopefully that even if you don't fill it out, that you've mentally filled it out and you come away from today thinking, I have some concrete steps that I actually want to do next week or when grading is submitted, and thinking about how your research is going to influence policy. And I like that quote here, the science policy gap won't close itself, we have to walk through the door. So I suppose it is about all of us taking that first step forward. We won't do, I think, does everybody here, does anyone want to comment or make a reflection on their own journey, or if their engagement with the policy piece, or what they'd like to take away from today?
Just to have 2 pages. Just to have a 2-page summary of what your research is.
So you've given us homework, is it?
No, it's just you talk to people.
Yes.
And blah 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 blah. But if you are able to leave them with a 2-page piece of paper, they might come back to you and say, "I passed that on to somebody else." Oh yes, that's what you're taking away. I love it. Sorry, I thought you were giving us homework. No. You know, nobody reads your thesis. Okay.
Absolutely.
So if you have a 2-page, as you say, very easy to read with maybe a picture on it. You have a conversation with somebody, it can be very, very positive, but they don't remember your name. You know?
Absolutely. You have to be able to, it's your job to step up and make the communication happen.
And a 2-page custom made for the occasion.
Fantastic. You know? I think Petra has something there.
I like the reminder that actually these policymakers aren't too different from us. They're stressed out civil servants or public servants. So to kind of keep that in mind, that actually, and in some ways it maybe reduces the barrier when we start to think of them not as completely other to what we're all trying to do something good, and most people want progress and positive change. So
absolutely. Thanks, Petra. Okay, so I want to give a huge thank you to my colleagues who've made the journey today to come to UL and share their expertise with us, Dr. Kieran Walsh and Dr. Karina Dorley. Really appreciate you coming and taking the time to do this. They're amazing to work with, but their expertise is fantastic as well, and it's great to be able to access it here for Research Week. Thanks, everybody.